Picture yourself at your kitchen table holding a retirement account statement, and the number staring back at you reads $44,000. You look at it twice, then check your phone, where the top headline announces that the average American retirement account just reached a record high of $167,000. Same country, same year, same economy. So you do the only logical thing, you assume you're falling behind, that everyone else got some memo you never received, and you fold that statement in half and slide it into the drawer with all the other paperwork you've decided not to face yet. That man is Marcus Bellamy, 41 years old, an HVAC installer working in Dayton, Ohio, statistically, the most average man in America. Here's the twist, he isn't behind at all. Both numbers you just heard are completely accurate. No one lied. And the distance between those two figures might be the most costly piece of financial misinformation you'll ever encounter. I'm Yank, and today we're tracking down the man hiding inside that gap, because he's out there. He's a real, living person with a very nice garage, and he has absolutely no clue he's quietly wrecking your sense of financial reality. Once you meet him, every jaw-dropping statistic about the average American will make sense, for reasons you didn't expect. Here's the sleight of hand, and once you spot it, you can't unsee it. Whenever someone says, the average American, they're almost always talking about the mean, add up everyone's numbers, divide by the head count, print the result. And that number is essentially meaningless. Picture 9 guys earning $50,000 a year sitting in a room with one guy earning $10 million. The average income in that room jumps to nearly $1.5 million. Suddenly everyone in the room is technically a millionaire, while 9 of them are still trying to figure out how to cover a transmission repair. Now watch what happens the moment that 10th guy walks out. The average income in the room instantly drops by about $1.5 million, and not a single person's actual life has changed one bit. The median works differently. It's the person standing dead center in the line, with exactly half the group ahead of him and half behind, and he genuinely doesn't care what the guy at the front of the line is holding. Nobody writes headlines about the median. It doesn't perform well in a headline. The median is an actual person. The mean is closer to a rumor. So Marcus's $44,000 is the median retirement account balance, based on Vanguard's data across millions of real accounts. The $167,000 you saw in the headline is the mean, pulled from that exact same data set, on the exact same day. That's not a rounding error, that gap is a snapshot of exactly who holds what in this country. Before we continue, one promise, there's a single number coming later in this video that's worse than everything else combined. It's the one that keeps me up at night, and I'm saving it until the end because you need everything else first for it to really hit. Let's begin with the statistic that should really end this conversation on its own. Every year, the Federal Reserve asks Americans one deceptively simple question: if a $400 emergency showed up tomorrow, could you cover it in cash? Not a credit card. Not a loan from a relative. Not the crumpled $20 sitting in a coat you haven't worn since March. Cash. Roughly 37% of people say no. And $400 isn't some medical catastrophe, that's a set of brake pads, or a water heater that started making a noise you've generously chosen to call character. Nearly 4 in 10 adults, in the wealthiest country in human history, can't absorb a $400 hit without borrowing. And it's not improving, that number was actually better back in 2021, when stimulus checks were still going out, than it is right now, 3 years into headlines celebrating a red-hot economy. So what actually happens when that $400 bill shows up? It goes on a credit card, and that's where the real damage quietly happens, math almost nobody says out loud. The average interest rate on cards that are actually carrying a balance now sits around 22%. On a brand new general purpose card, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau clocked rates north of 25%. And the minimum payment, that friendly little line on your statement, usually works out to about 2% of the balance. Put those numbers together and something ugly emerges. On a $2,000 balance at 22% interest, the minimum payment comes to about $40 a month. Of that $40, roughly $36 goes straight to interest, and only about $4 actually chips away at what you owe. You're paying $40 a month essentially to stand still. That's not a repayment plan, that's a subscription to your own past. Collectively, that's how Americans ended up paying $160 billion in credit card interest in a single year, not principal, just interest. That's the toll we pay, as a country, for not having $400 on hand. Now let's talk cars, because if the credit card is the wound, the car is the weapon. The average new car payment in America right now is roughly $770 a month. For a used car, it's about $530. And close to 19% of new car buyers, nearly 1 in 5, are signing up for payments north of $1,000 a month, just to sit in a marginally nicer seat during traffic. But it's that $770 figure I really want you to sit with, because I don't think most people have actually run this math. Take $770 a month and invest it instead at an 8% annual return over 40 years, and it compounds to roughly $2.4 million. Read that again, the average American car payment represents a $2.4 million decision. Which tells you the average American isn't too broke to become a millionaire, they're financing a depreciating asset instead of investing in an appreciating one, stretched across 60, 72, sometimes 84-month loans. 84 months, that used to be a mortgage timeline, not a car loan. And subprime auto loan delinquencies are now at their highest level ever recorded. To be fair, most people genuinely need a car, it's how you get to the job that pays for the car. That's not really a lifestyle choice, that's a toll booth with a steering wheel. Here's where this stops being about personal spending habits altogether. Roughly 29% of people using Buy Now Pay Later services have used them specifically to finance groceries. Groceries. Nearly half of all users have made a late payment within the past year, and more than half admit they genuinely couldn't make ends meet without these services. Which brings us to Sienna Cole. She's 29, a dental hygienist earning about $58,000 a year, and she splits her grocery bill into 4 installments, not out of carelessness, but because payday lands on Friday and her kid needs dinner on Tuesday, and Tuesday has never once been willing to wait. Every Sunday night, Sienna does something worth sitting with. She opens her banking app, then her credit card app, then her Buy Now Pay Later app, then the app for the second Buy Now Pay Later service she signed up for once the first one hit its limit. She runs the numbers across 4 separate screens just to figure out which day of the week she's allowed to buy chicken. She's never called this budgeting, she'd feel embarrassed to. She calls it checking. Sienna isn't a cautionary tale. She's a solvency bridge running through a phone app, and there are millions of people just like her, which is exactly the thing I want you to hold on to for the rest of this video. Every statistic coming up sounds like a tale of individual failure. It isn't. It's a story about math that quietly stopped working, and an entire industry that showed up, very conveniently, to sell people financing for the shortfall. Total household debt in America just crossed $18.8 trillion, and the composition of that number matters more than its size. It isn't a mountain of luxury purchases, it's $13 trillion in homes people needed to actually live in. $1.5 trillion in cars they needed to get to work, another $1.5 trillion in degrees they were told were mandatory, and a bit over $1 trillion in credit card debt that mostly went toward groceries, brake pads, and water heaters. That's not a spending spree, that's a country putting its own survival on layaway. And the student loan piece of this just fell off a cliff. Once the pandemic-era pause on reporting delinquencies ended, the share of balances 90 days or more past due jumped from under 1% to over 10%. That's not a decline, that's a trap door. Okay, that's the debt side. Now let's look at what's supposed to sit on the other side of the ledger. Back to Marcus and his $44,000, because there's a second half to that story, and it's worse. The standard financial guideline says you can safely withdraw about 4% of your retirement savings each year without running out of money. 4% of $44,115 comes out to $1.765 a year, which is $147 a month. The median American's retirement plan pays out $147 a month. Even if we're generous and only look at people already 65 and older, the median payout is about $318 a month, while retirees themselves report needing north of $800,000 to retire comfortably. So it isn't that most Americans have a small retirement account, it's that most Americans don't really have a retirement plan at all. What they have is Social Security, plus a tip. And I'm not saying that as a joke. About 78% of retirees rely on Social Security, and for people who earned under $50,000 a year, that climbs closer to 85%. 1 in 5 adults over 50 has nothing saved for retirement at all. Nothing. Zero. Which brings us to the single most load-bearing number in this entire system, the one nobody wants to say out loud into a microphone. The latest trustees report projects that the Social Security Retirement Trust Fund runs dry around late 2032. After that point, payroll taxes alone cover only about 77% of promised benefits, a very polite, very technical way of saying there's an automatic 23% cut coming to the income source that 4 out of 5 retirees currently depend on. Congress can fix this. Congress has fixed it before. But it's worth knowing the beam is cracked before someone tells you the whole house is fine. And you can watch people improvising around this in real time. 6% of workers took a hardship withdrawal from their 401k last year, up from just 2% 4 years earlier, and that number keeps climbing every single year. Workers earning under $100,000 were 3.5 times more likely to take one. Sit with that for a second. The retirement account has effectively become the emergency fund, because the actual emergency fund doesn't exist. We're eating the seed corn in a country that won't stop bragging about the record harvest. Now let's talk about what this actually feels like, because a statistic is just a feeling somebody dropped into a spreadsheet. It feels like standing in the cereal aisle doing the same math you already did in the car. It feels like that full body drop when the check engine light comes on, followed by the 2 seconds where you calculate whether you can get away with pretending you didn't see it. It feels like telling your kid, in a light, casual voice, that the field trip probably isn't happening this time, and then being furious with yourself for how convincing that voice has become. It feels like lying awake at 2 a.m. running numbers you've already run 40 times, as if the 41st attempt might somehow come out differently. And more than anything, it feels like being the only one, which is the part these statistics get completely wrong, because 37% isn't an abstract number when you're standing in the cereal aisle. When you're standing in the cereal aisle, that 37% is just you. Quick detour into housing, because you already sense where this is going. The median home price is about $427,000. Median household income is about $83,700. That works out to a price-to-income ratio of roughly 5 to 1. In 1990, that ratio was 3.2 to 1. In 1970, it was 2.2 to 1. And the house didn't get 3 times better, it's the same beige carpet, nobody added a wing. Half of all renters in America, a record 22.6 million households, now spend more than 30% of their income on rent, and 12 million of them spend more than half their income on it. Realtors report the median first-time homebuyer is now 40 years old, though that figure is contested. Mortgage records put it closer to 33. I'd rather tell you both numbers than pretend I only saw one. Either way, nobody disputes the direction. In the 1980s, the median first-time buyer was 29. We've bolted nearly a decade onto that runway either way. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Yank, this is all pretty bleak, but maybe things are actually improving, and you're just cherry-picking the worst numbers you could dig up. Fair, you should be thinking that. And here's the thing, you'd be partly right. So let me hand you the strongest version of that argument myself. 401k participation just hit a record 86%, up from 65% 2 decades ago. The poverty rate fell to about 10.5%, near its lowest point ever recorded, down from 22% back in 1959. And between 2019 and 2023, real wages for the lowest paid 10% of American workers actually grew faster than for anyone above them, clawing back a real chunk of 4 decades of widening inequality. Those numbers are all true, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But look very closely at that first one, because it's the whole ballgame. Why did 401k participation jump to 86%? Was it some national outbreak of financial discipline? Did everyone suddenly read the same book? No. It's that 61% of plans now enroll workers automatically, and within those automatic enrollment plans, participation runs around 94%. In plans where you have to opt in yourself, it's only about 64%. Same humans, same paychecks, same willpower, a 30-point swing. The single most successful piece of retirement policy in modern American history worked by flipping a default checkbox, not by changing a single person's character. Nobody got any smarter. Someone just moved the default setting. Which proves the exact thing I most want you to walk away with: the fragility isn't human nature, it's a setting, and somebody chose it. And it cuts both ways. The average American spends about $219 a month on subscriptions while believing they only spend $86. That's not a personal character flaw, that's a business model built on the mathematical certainty that you won't actually check. Americans spent $14.7 billion on lottery tickets in a single year, in a country where 37% of people can't scrape together $400 for an emergency. The house doesn't just win, the house helps fund the school system with money taken from people who can't afford brake pads, and then that same school system never gets around to teaching financial literacy. So let me finally introduce you to the man hiding inside the gap. His name is Walter Finch, 63 years old, an orthodontist practicing just outside Scottsdale, with $2.1 million sitting in his retirement accounts. He got there by earning a strong income for 30 straight years and doing nothing particularly clever with it, which, honestly, is how it's usually done. Walter isn't a villain in this story. He's never met Marcus, and he never will. He's a decent guy who happens to be excellent at teeth. But Walter is exactly why that headline said $167,000. Walter, and a few million people just like him, are what turns Marcus's $44,000 into a number that makes Marcus feel like a failure. Walter isn't hiding anything, he was simply averaged into the data, and Marcus was quietly measured against the result. That's the real con here, nobody committed fraud. The system just built a measuring stick out of everybody, handed it to the guy standing in the middle of the line, and let him conclude on his own that he'd come up short. If you're sitting there right now feeling that specific, quiet shame, the kind that makes a person fold up a piece of paper and hide it in a drawer, hear me out. You were told to measure yourself against an average that's engineered to include the top 10%, who hold about 67% of all the wealth in this country. You were told retirement was entirely your personal responsibility, then handed a system where 6% of your coworkers are already rating theirs just to keep the lights on. You were told to budget better by an industry that makes $160 billion a year on the fact that you consistently can't. You are not behind. You were measured with a ruler that was built crooked on purpose. This is exactly the kind of thing we break down inside our community, where we dig into the real numbers instead of the headline versions of them. Links are in the description if you want to join us. Now, I promised you one number worse than everything else. Here it is. Median American household net worth is about $192,900. The mean is about $1,063,700, there's Walter again, more than 5.5 times higher. But strip out home equity, because you can't eat your kitchen, and the median American household's net worth collapses to somewhere around $57,900. That's it. That's the entire cushion outside the walls you sleep inside and still owe the bank for. The middle of this country has roughly $58,000 to cover retirement, emergencies, a layoff, a bad diagnosis, and 30 years of simply being old. That's the number that stays with me. So what do you actually do with all of this? Start by ditching the mean, that one's free. Every time you hear the phrase, average American, attached to money, ask average of what, and notice how often the honest answer is some guy in Scottsdale you're never going to meet. You were never actually competing with him. Next, change one default instead of trying to make 20 heroic decisions, because that's precisely what the 86% figure taught us. Automate the transfer on payday so the money is gone before you become a person with opinions about it. Bump your contribution rate up 1%, just once, then forget you ever did it. And take that $770 number seriously, because it genuinely belongs to you. Most people need a car. Nobody needs that car. And the difference between the two, compounded across an entire working life, is a 7-figure number that no act of Congress and no trust fund shortfall can ever touch. I want to leave you back at that kitchen table. Marcus took the statement back out of the drawer. He didn't fix his whole life. Nobody fixes their whole life in one sitting. He logged into the portal and bumped his contribution from 4% up to 5%, which cost him about $32.19 per paycheck, and he set it to automatically increase again every January, so he'd never have to be brave about it twice. Sienna is still splitting her groceries into 4 payments, because $58,000 is still $58,000, and no YouTube video has ever once moved a payday. But last Sunday, she only opened 3 apps instead of 4, because she finally called her card company and asked, out loud, for the very first time in her life, what her actual interest rate was, 26.9%. Nobody had ever told her. She'd never asked, because she'd always assumed that number was some kind of verdict on her character rather than just a price tag on a product. And Walter is doing just fine. Walter was always going to be fine. Right now, he's out there being quietly averaged into the data, with absolutely no idea that a man in Dayton spent 8 years believing he was a failure because of him. That's the actual shocking statistic here, not that the average American is broke, but that the average American doesn't exist. It's that the real one, the guy standing dead center in the line, has spent his entire working life comparing himself to a ghost and quietly concluding he came up short. You didn't come up short. You were just handed the wrong number. Go get the right one.